So it was a dirty bargain. Was it a bargain worth making?
I believe that it was a bargain worth making because we wouldn't be the same country that we were today. And although the Constitution did have slavery in it, and I think that had to be there in order to ratify the document, and that they made a lot of compromises that were worth it.
And though I do not necessarily agree with this, some would argue that this compromise actually came back to bite us in the form of the Civil War. I mean, it was left to kind of fester, and it eventually came out and showed its ugly head. It reared its ugly head in the form of this war between the states. And you kind of have to ask whether, if you had taken slavery out, whether we would be a nation, or was it worth it? Was the Civil War kind of was it worth all that bloodshed to kind of create this union in the first place?
And as argued in Federalist 38, it said that it is not necessary that the former should be perfect. It is sufficient that the latter is more imperfect, saying that the Articles of Confederation wasn't working, and the Constitution was a step in the right direction.
And many delegates at the time of the ratification thought that slavery would actually have died out and would no longer be used in the United States by 1808. However, that was proven wrong.
So it was so in your, seems like the sense of the panel is that imperfect as it was worth doing. Why the emphasis on secrecy, both in the drafting of the Constitution and then the publishing of what we would today call op-ed pieces under pseudonyms, by using pseudonyms that did not really reflect accurately who the author was?
Well, during the convention, many European delegations many European countries sent delegations to Philadelphia to try and see what the United States was doing, and that was one of the reasons they had such secrecy, so as to prevent European nations from finding out what the United States was up to.
Also, at the time of the Constitutional Convention, the constituents were worried that the public, if they knew what was going on, would have too much of an influence on the formation of this new Constitution, and that it would not necessarily be a good thing for them to know what is going on at that moment in time.
And for the secrecy for the names actually on the papers, the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers, I think it was because it was reflecting what their voice was versus what the contents of the paper was versus who was saying it. And so that when people were reading them, they were really reading the contents and what the point the person was trying to make.
But can you really assess, are ideas really that pristine? I mean, can they be fully understood without understanding the motives of the author?
Well, within the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers, they made it very clear whether they were supporting or not supporting this new Constitution. And I think it was one of those kind of things where for Federalist papers, they were going through clause by pretty much what was good about it and what was bad about it. So I think it didn't really matter who the person was, but because they all knew what they were referring to, which was this new Constitution.
Were the delegates justified in creating new rules for the ratification of the Constitution? Why? Why not?
I believe that they were right in having 9 out of 13 states, as compared to the Articles of Confederation, where they required 13 out of 13 states to make an amendment, because there were never any amendments passed under the Articles of Confederation. I think it was proved that 13 out of 13 states was impossible, and 9 out of 13 states secured a majority of the nation.
And a more current example to kind of tie this into is in 2008, the European Union sent out the Lisbon Treaty to all of its member nations and needed 100% approval from all of its member nations to pass it. And Ireland was the only country that did not approve it because they sent it to their people through a referendum. And by doing that, the people said no, that they did not want this treaty, which would essentially have created a president of Europe. And so that document was shut down.
Looking at the ratification of the Constitution by a convention, what was that precedent followed in the ratification of the 27 amendments that we have now to the Constitution?
I think it was, in most of the amendment cases, I believe it was followed However, many of the southern states, after rejoining the Union after their secession, believe that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were not truly ratified because they were almost forced to adopt them when they entered the Union at the time.
Most of the amendments were approved by the state legislatures. Only the 21st Amendment to repeal prohibition was by state convention. So that was one example where they did use go like the Constitution conventions.
What can you say about the timing of the various states' ratifications that played a role in the ultimate success of the ratification process?
The Federalists were very careful with what they were doing. They sort of made, at first they were going for just the smaller states who would probably benefit from this larger government, which would be able to protect them. And then the larger states who would take more persuasion, they would take longer. And they realized this sort of after going after Pennsylvania rather quickly. And there was a lot of controversy there because some of the Pennsylvanians felt that their voice hadn't been heard properly. And they didn't want to upset the huge population of these powerful states who were considered themselves separate and sovereign. So they played it very carefully.
What about New York?
New York, I think, was one of those states where, obviously, that's where a lot of the Federalist Papers were published, and so it was this big thing where this constitutional discourse was happening. And
Can you tell me, was it early in the process, late in the process?
it was like 2/3, I believe, through the process, and they were very much waiting at to watch a few of the other states, such as Massachusetts, whether they would ratify it.
And large states such as New York and Virginia, the Federalists knew those would be the hardest to have ratify the Constitution because they were so large and they had such powerful economies, and many, such as the Carolinas, had very strong militias in their colonies at the time, so they knew that it was going to be hard to get them to ratify the large states.
A few minutes ago, you mentioned that the small states would probably benefit from the ratification of the Constitution. What were those supposed benefits that would help states like Delaware, for example?
Economics was one reason, and then also common defense. Economically, they relied on both from the southern states who were producing crops and whatnot, and then also from the northern states which had ports and were doing trade, and so it was just an economic benefit.
And you kind of also have to look at, not always is one small entity joining a larger one necessarily a good thing. With the European Union recently, France and the Netherlands kind of vetoed what was going to be more of a continental constitution for the fear that the smaller countries that would not be able to pass their own laws and that their power would be diminished under this larger entity.
And under the Articles of Confederation, the states were basically little countries running around. They were not united, and the smaller states could be attacked by, or they feared they could be attacked, and so they came together for their common defense.
And this was so much so that even during the Revolutionary War, George Washington asked his troops to pledge their allegiance to the United States instead of their individual states because of his fear of this.
Thank you.